SYS presents Adventures in Online Education.
Hello, friends. You're listening to SYS Presents Adventures in Online Education. I'm your host, Natalie Conway. Thanks for being here. On today's episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Matt Miller. Matt is the author of 5 books, including Ditch That Textbook. His Ditch That Textbook blog reaches thousands of educators in more than 100 countries with inspiration and practical teaching ideas. He's a keynote speaker, podcast host, and the creator of the Ditch That Textbook Digital Summit. Today, we talk about not just ditching textbooks, but finding your hammer. You're going to want to hear this one. So, are you ready? Let's learn something new. Matt Miller, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I am honored to speak with you today. I have just been watching you in the Ditch That Textbook group on Twitter for so long, and I'm really excited to get to speak with you today and have our audience hear your insight, your experience, and just your take on EdTech and digital learning. So let's dive in. You are the individual behind Ditch That Textbook. It's a really robust online community and a plethora of resources, which only grows with every year. I am so curious to know, what's the mission behind your work? What's driving you to influence the world of EdTech? And how does your work, what you're doing and what those who you work with are doing, how does that support us who are fully online?
Yeah, so as far as the mission behind the work, the whole Ditch That Textbook thing, that all sort of started when I was teaching high school Spanish in a, sort of a traditional, regular face-to-face high school. And I was, using my textbooks like so many people do. And I started to realize that my textbooks were not really helping me accomplish the goals that I had for my class of, having my students be able to speak fluent Spanish. They were actually sort of a hindrance, almost like a roadblock to what I was really trying to do. And so I just started trying some different things, just experimenting with other things. And some of them didn't work, but some of them did. And once I started finding some of those things that did work, I wanted to be able to share them with other people, just in case it could be useful or helpful to somebody else. And what I started doing there really is sort of the mission of what I'm trying to do right now, which is to find things that work in the classroom and just help share them with teachers. Because, Natalie, you know as well as I do that teachers all over the United States and really all over the world are strapped for time, and they have tons of things that they have to do, and just trying to do the act of teaching and all of the things around it can lead to burnout pretty easily. And so my goal really is just to try to save teachers time and equip them so that maybe they can get out the door a little bit quicker. Maybe they can level up their level of teaching kind of along the way. And I have found, since you mentioned ed tech in your question, I've found that technology can help do that, just that we can find ways that technology can help support really great teaching. Whether that's taking something that we've been doing for a while that we know works, that's kind of like pedagogically sound, and trying to find ways to elevate it. Or maybe we can sort of retool the entire experience using technology to kind of change it up, but also still keep that good, solid learning at heart. And sometimes it's just that teachers need ideas, they could use some help trying to figure out what that's supposed to look like. Sometimes if you can just see somebody's example or the way that somebody does it, that kind of gives you some ideas. And thankfully, a lot of the things that I like to talk about related to technology, and a lot of the things that kind of cross over the whole face-to-face versus fully online, a lot of those things are based on just good, solid teaching. People who have been teaching for a while know what works.
Yes.
And some of the best practice and pedagogy and everything kind of tell us what works. But a lot of the stuff crosses over when it comes to face-to-face learning and online learning, especially when you incorporate the technology component in it. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of adapting for your specific learning environment or your learning management system or something like that. But really, good teaching is good teaching, and hopefully the technology is just sort of like amplifies and elevates what we've known has been good for a long time.
Absolutely. I think teachers are often intimidated by the idea of ditching a textbook or not leaning heavily on the resources that have been provided. And so it's great to see the work that you do and your community does around building up that self-efficacy, really, for educators, because you're right, good teaching is good teaching, right? And no matter where it's happening, how it's happening is what matters most. And educators do have the skills to create effective and engaging lessons. And I think one of the hardest things for a lot of folks is trusting themselves or believing that they have those skills. Do you have any advice for folks who maybe are in the same boat you were in as a high school Spanish teacher, where they're like, you know what? This textbook isn't working, or this scripted curriculum is not working, and I'm not beholden to a curriculum. I have to be faithful to standards. Like what's kind of the first step in a ditching the textbook journey for an educator?
Yeah, well, I think, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because sometimes whenever people hear that term, ditch that textbook, they just assume, oh, that means that he's going to make us stop using our textbooks, or he thinks that textbooks are evil, which isn't the case. It's a resource for the students and for the teacher. And the last thing that I want to do is to take resources out of the hands of teachers and students. But I also think that today, especially in this day and age, we can do a lot better than just marching chapter by chapter through a textbook and then just, assigning some workbook pages or some worksheets or something. So when it comes to that idea of ditch that textbook, I would encourage people to do kind of what I did at the beginning, which was start small and take it little by little. Maybe find something where your traditional normal way of teaching just isn't getting the job done. And you go, you know what? And I've had things like this in my own classroom. So this is me as much as anybody else. But I would look at it and go, the way that I'm teaching this right now, it can't get much worse than this. So if I try something new, it can't really be worse than the way that it's already going. And so sometimes if you find that, that's kind of a low stakes way to start trying something. And you just kind of look at your students and, you look at the curriculum and you go, okay, what else might work? Sometimes I would turn to, like, popular culture. What are my students into? And can I make an analogy with it? Or maybe I can present it or have my students create in a different format. So, maybe something through video or audio or a mashup of images or whatever, just kind of like experimenting with different things. And you've brought it back to the community that, we've got a nice online community on Twitter through the Ditchbook hashtag. I think that's really important when it comes to all of this too, is sometimes you get great ideas just by looking around and seeing what other people are doing. That's why, for me over the years, being connected on social media, especially on Twitter, has been such a great source of ideas where I don't have to come up with everything all on my own. I can see what other people are doing, what tools they're using, what lessons they're teaching, what creative ideas they're trying, and then try to adjust it to fit what I do. So that kind of makes it a little bit less daunting when you don't have to come up with all of the ideas. So I think those are a couple of places that I think people can turn.
Absolutely. Those are great places to start. And I want to echo what you said about Twitter being a really positive place for educators. I know social media in general is maybe not the most positive place we could all be spending our time, but EduTwitter is fantastic. I myself have learned so much from fellow educators, and especially those in ed tech, having been doing that for the last few years now. But that community is very generous as well. Everyone is willing to share ideas openly and freely. And there are countless videos, websites, blogs, freebies, all of that folks can find. So I really encourage listeners today, if you haven't connected with Ditch That Textbook or Matt Miller or that community online, to really do so, because you're going to have your eyes open to a whole lot of opportunities. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to dive a little bit more deeply into EdTech tools and finding the right tool for the teaching job. So stick with us. What's the one thing all online schools and programs struggle with? Student engagement and the ability to truly personalize interventions. How do we solve those problems? With the use of Admin Dash, a brand new Canvas LTI tool from SYS Education. Admin Dash allows online teachers to see a risk assessment score that proactively identifies students who may need more specialized attention or intervention, and offers a communication log that provides an outlet for complete transparency among teachers, admin, students, and families. At just 99 cents per student per year, and with no minimum price and no fees, you can't afford to not use Admin Dash. For more information about Admin Dash, contact sales at syseducation.org and start connecting proactively with your online learners. Welcome back, online educators. I'm talking to Matt Miller of Ditch That Textbook. Every year, Matt, there are shiny new EdTech tools marketed to all of us. Some of them are great and really fun to use. I've talked with Fons Mendoza, who hopefully a lot of you are listening to and following nowadays. I've talked to Fons about choosing the right tool for the teaching job before, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. You have a YouTube video in particular, which we'll link in the show notes. But in that YouTube video, you make the analogy of a carpenter getting excited about a new hammer and then wondering, what can I build with this? You explain how obviously that is not how we think about things in the real world. We have a goal in mind, a project, a problem, something like that, and we seek out the right tools for that job to solve that problem. You mentioned backward planning too, which we discussed this season with the amazing Jay McTighe. Oftentimes, online educators are given tools to use. We're given the shiny new hammer, and we may not or may have a say in what those tools are. How do you advise online educators to answer that question? How does this fit?
Yeah, that's a good question. How does this fit? That definitely is, I think that's something that a lot of teachers are trying to wrestle with. And I really like that you brought up at the beginning that these ed tech tools are being marketed to us because, as much as we appreciate and enjoy using a lot of these tools, and some of them we use for free, the reality is that all of these are companies that are creating these tools, or at least the vast majority of them are companies that are trying to generate a profit in some way, shape, or form. The other thing we have to remember with all of this too is that some of these companies have a really good grasp of what it's like to be a teacher and what we need to support really great learning, but some of them don't. Even with some of them, you use the word shiny. I think that's such an appropriate word because they'll put on a shiny facade to kind of lure us in. And then in the end, we end up, using these tools and we're going, now, how is this really supposed to support learning? So I think that's an important thing to remember at the beginning. But you mentioned my carpenter analogy and, getting a new hammer and going, well, what can I do with a hammer? And I think that when you're trying to figure out how this fits, how does this tech tool fit? It's kind of like that carpenter or that woodworker. They kind of get a vision of what it is that they want to create. And if you'll go with me in your imagination into the woodworker's workshop, and you go up to their workbench and you look on the wall behind it, and there's all of these tools hanging up behind on the wall that have all these different purposes. There's different things that they all do, but the master woodworker knows what each of them does and when to use them. And so when you talk about, here's what I'd like to be able to create, the woodworker can look at those tools and go, oh, we're going to need this, and we're going to need this, and we're going to need this. And we're pulling all of these tools off of the wall. So I think that's one big part of it, is to amass lots of tools that you can use at your disposal. So kind of learning about different ones and what they do and everything. You might even pick some of those up from some of your teacher friends or other people in education and what works well for them. But that being said, sometimes amassing a whole bunch of tools isn't necessarily going to get the job done. Sometimes you need to go back to that tried and true hammer, I think. There's a reason that you use a hammer for a lot of things. It's because it's versatile. And so for me, my hammer, so to speak, is Google Slides. I love Google Slides because you really can use it for a wide variety of things. It's one of those tools where I can come up with 10 different uses for it, or maybe more than 10 different uses for this one particular tool, which in some cases I think is a lot better than saying, I'm going to find 10 different tools that can only do one thing. I would rather have one tool that can do 10 different things than to have 10 different tools that all do one thing in and of their own, because, whenever students have to learn a whole bunch of different tools, they have to learn about the buttons and what the tool does. And, they have to get used to the user interface and everything. So sometimes it's good to rely on one thing that's very versatile so that we can keep the focus on the learning, I think. So I think when we ask that question, how does this all fit? It kind of comes down to turning yourself into a masterful woodworker when you use your educational technology, where you have the tools at your disposal, but you're really trying to keep things simple and also trying to just pull in the right tools for the job.
Absolutely. I love how you said, find your hammer. That is brilliant. Yes. And what a great analogy, because the thing that is simple is going to be the thing we go back to and use over and over and over again. Think of our smartphones in our hands every day, right? If those weren't super easy to use, we wouldn't use them. If they weren't versatile and did 1,000 things, we wouldn't use them. And I'm with you. I'm a huge fan of Google Slides. I think that there's an unnumbered amount of things that you could possibly do and engage kids with slides. And so that's a great example. We want to really think first about the teaching and the lesson and the activities, and then second about the tech that will support that. So I think sometimes we get excited and we want to start with the tech, but we have to pause on that and start with our end goal. What is it we want to accomplish? What is it we're trying to do here? And then what thing that my kids already know or that I'm already familiar with is going to do that really well. And then maybe a piece of advice Fonz Mendoza gave that you alluded to as well is like really getting to know that tech tool. So really knowing the interface, knowing what all the buttons do, all of that is really important. That takes time too. So giving ourselves time, even something as simple or seemingly simple as Google Slides, can do a lot more than you might first realize when you're exploring with it initially or using it just to show images and text, that kind of thing. There are endless possibilities. Matt, I have one final question for you. I feel like we've talked about so many things and I'm so inspired. If there was one thing, material or otherwise, you could give to every teacher in the United States, what would it be and why?
Oh man, there's so many different directions we could go with this. I know for one, there's so many materials that they could use. I see it all over Twitter. There's all of those clear the list campaigns where everybody's sharing their lists and everybody's got a ton of things that they need for their classrooms. And I wish we could just all go in and just sprinkle a whole bunch of money into all of those Amazon lists. But instead of going the physical material route, I'm going to go a little different direction. And if I could give every teacher in the United States something that would help them with their instruction, that would make it a little bit easier and better and maybe get them out the door a little bit faster, it would be a basic understanding of cognitive science. This is kind of a nerdy answer, and there's so many different directions that this could go, but hear me out on this. The reason I bring that up is because I think there's lots of things related to the concept of teaching that can be informed by what science has learned about how the brain learns and how it prefers to do things. And if we understood that, there's a lot of ways that I think we could teach smarter instead of harder if we just kind of knew some of those things. One of my favorite places to go with this is with this concept called retrieval practice. It's this very, very basic idea that the brain learns better if we recall, well, it learns better for the long term, at least, whenever we recall information out of our brains instead of cramming more information into it. So if we want to create that long-lasting, long-term memory, if we would give students more opportunities to answer a question like, what do you remember from class yesterday? What do you remember about this particular topic? Write down everything that you remember about this. In that case, we're calling information out of our brains instead of cramming information in. Because if you think about it, whenever we ask students to study, we ask them to, a lot of times, go back over their notes, reread the material, go back through the chapter. In that case, the information is flowing into the brain. But science has told us that the brain learns best and retains information best for the long term if we have students call information out of it. And that's just a teeny tiny little shift. That's like a low prep, high return on investment type of shift that we can make that helps students remember things much better. And that's just sort of scratching the surface when it comes to, things like elaboration and spacing, giving the brain an opportunity to forget things before it starts to, recall it and remember it again. The act of forgetting is part of learning. And another direction I love to go with this too is the power of emotion. They talk about how whenever something is tied to a strong emotion, emotion is one way that the brain learns what's important so that it makes it easier to recall. And so if students are enjoying what they're doing and they're loving the learning, it's not just, something that's a bunch of fluff. It's actually something that will help that learning stick. So there's so much that we can learn about cognitive science, about the way that the brain prefers to learn. And when we know that stuff, I think it can help inform us. So it's like we're not just doing things in a harder way, even though we don't want it to be a harder way. We don't try to make it harder, but sometimes I think we accidentally do because we don't know any better. So that's kind of a nerdy answer to your question. And I've kind of rambled on and on about this, but I think there's a lot that can be informed about this particular thing that can really help things for students and for teachers.
I love nerding out on all things education, so it's okay. You're hanging with Nerdily today, so you're in a safe place. And I love that gift of additional knowledge of cognitive science. I love reading about neuroscience and education, and I think a lot of what you said rings very true and is very cool. So all in here. Matt, this has been awesome. It's such a pleasure talking with you, learning from you. If listeners want more, where can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so probably the best place is to go to my Ditch That Textbook website. It's just at ditchthattextbook.com. And the best thing I think that comes out of that is that we're constantly creating new resources to make teachers' lives a little easier, give you some new ideas and some new plug and play things you can use in class tomorrow. And so if your listeners want to get plugged into all of that stuff and have that pipeline of new ideas coming in on a regular basis, I would highly encourage them to sign up for my weekly email newsletter, which has, lots of teaching ideas that you can put into practice right away. We create these templates that you can make a copy of and assign directly to your students, and just all sorts of teaching resources to equip you to plan your lessons for the week and everything. The easiest way to do that is just to go to ditchthattextbook.com/101. And the reason that it's 101 is because there's a couple of free ebooks that go along with your subscription, which, by the way, is completely free. All of this is free. But those ebooks have all sorts of practical teaching ideas that you can use in class right away. So you get the free ebooks with that subscription, but then you also are subscribed to that email newsletter, that free email newsletter that comes out once a week. So that's definitely a good way to go. I'm all over Twitter. My Twitter username is jmattmiller. So you can go check that out if you want to as well.
We'll have links in the show notes to all of the ways that you can find Matt Miller and all the Ditch That textbook resources at your fingertips. Matt, thanks again for being here today.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of SYS Presents Adventures in Online Education. Special thanks to my guest today, Matt Miller. Matt reminded us that we all can get many great ideas from others, and that there is power in finding our hammer, that tool that is multi-purpose, easy to use, and effective. If you liked what you heard today, please hit subscribe and give us a 5-star rating. Want to connect? On Twitter, you can follow the show at SYS Presents. We love hearing from you. If you're interested in finding out more about SYS Education and our products and services, head on over to syseducation.org. Lastly, this podcast wouldn't be possible without our exceptional team at SYS Education, including our dream team consisting of sound engineer Natalie Farrell, graphic designer and social media and website manager Lexi Boren, and our producer Bo Neal. Thanks for listening today, and remember, we can learn new things.